Okay, so today I've got Taylor Ellwood and Joanna Brook. Hi, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome. Pleasure to be
Cool.
here.
So, look, traditional first question is, what do you do?
Well, I am Taylor Ellwood, and I am a magical experimenter. I'm also an author of over 50 books at this point, some fiction and most of them nonfiction, a lot of them about magic and the occult. And I'm also a poet. And now it's to you, my dear.
I am a priestess, a moon priestess, and also I do a Venus ceremony when Venus goes retrograde. I have a labyrinth ceremony that I carry that I offer to the community. I'm a tarot reader. I've been reading professionally since 2007. And I'm also a medium, so I can contact the spirits of departed loved ones. Yeah, and together we are Brightheart Alchemy Guides, and that's just a recent thing. It really has been an alchemical process since we met. My business in terms of what I'm offering to the community has really expanded exponentially since we started working together. So it's exciting.
And you're also a poet.
I'm also a poet and a writer as well, yes.
So this is what I like when you get sort of multiple layers of creativity, and you often get this actually with people that are, well, I think magically operant. I've noticed also there's within, because I'm a musician as a mainstay of what I do, and occasionally you get this with musicians where there's, you know, they've got the music, but there's the art and there's something else going on in the background. So I'm really fascinated about the whole sort of creative process going on there. So I'll throw this one out to you. When let's pick up on the sort of magical aspect of stuff, the mediumship and all the rest of it. When did you first become aware of that sort of side of life, or was it a case that it was never shut down, if you see what I mean, like early on?
For me, it was never I was never shut down. I had some, like many magical people, I had experiences with fairy realms when I was a small child, and I consider those to be very real experiences. And then in 2012, after I'd been reading tarot professionally for some time, a friend of a friend asked me if I was able to contact someone that she loved who had died. And I said, I don't know, let's try. And I asked her for the person's name and their date of birth or their date of death, because I didn't want to I wanted to make sure I was getting a hold of the right person. And when I reached out, I just said my name, and I said my magical name, and I said, I'm asking to speak to this person. And I saw a very starry scape, like I was moving through space. And then I heard this voice, and I told the friend of a friend what the person was saying. And she said, wow, that sounds just like him. And she had some questions, and we had a conversation. And yeah, so that's how that happened. And I decided, with, you know, some assistance from other from elders in my community, about what kind of boundaries to put around that process. I loved the movie Ghost. That's like my era, you know, and with Whoopi Goldberg as the medium, and she has this experience in that movie where her body is taken over by various spirits and she doesn't know how to control it. And I was like, I'm not going to have that happen. What can I do to make sure that this is a really safe container for me and for the people that I'm working with? Yeah.
Cool. Brilliant. So would you say that
Maybe we should
just pick it up on what you say, Joanna, because I know Taylor's desperate to get in here. Let's just I'm just thinking of something that you said. I mean, because obviously you involved in tarot reading for quite a long time before that.
Yeah.
What took you into that?
I had an empathic experience where it was winter time and I was walking down a rush hour street in kind of dark, and I felt all these different emotions coming by me. And I was like, I know these are not my emotions. I'm picking up on these feelings that people are having. I was on my way to a bookstore in Ann Arbor, Michigan called the Crazy Wisdom Bookstore. And I saw a sign for a tarot class. And I was like, I need a tool because this is a weird experience. I don't know what to do about it. I need a tool to work with. And I have a degree in literature and creative writing. And so tarot for me is the perfect kind of tool for that because it's an unbound book. It's a bunch of pages, so many infinite stories you can tell. And it has a lot to do with what people are feeling and the experiences that each of us might have in our daily lives. So that really did help me figure out how to work with some of those abilities that I have. And traditionally, the tarot in many, occult traditions is a way to access some of these great archetypes and some of these broader experiences that we want to have as magicians, to access some of those energies. So it is a threshold to cross over. It is a path to walk in order to access the creativity that comes with doing magic.
Cool, thanks. Yeah. So Taylor.
Yes.
How did you get involved in this? Because I mean, how many books? You say 50 books?
Yeah, over 50. I just published, or I just put out Scrying the Divine on Tuesday, so I think it's over 50 now. Yeah. Which is a book about working with spirits using scrying and my various experiments with it. Well, I mean, I would say it's fair to say that I've always had some degree of connection with the spirit world. I was drowned when I was 7 years old, and that was an experience that was really pivotal because
that sounds good.
Because well, I mean, I was held underneath an inner tube and drowned by a person. Fortunately, I was resuscitated, but in that process, I had this experience where I ended up contacting, or a spirit ended up contacting me and basically helping to keep me alive in return for being able to connect with me more. And so then I after that, I think it was when I really, there was an interest in the occult and magic. And I grew up with reading the Greek myths by Robert Graves, 1 and 2, and reading the Aeneid. And so I was always drawn to mythology. I found myself drawn a lot to the stories of Aphrodite and Inanna and Gilgamesh and all that stuff. So that was always really profound for me. And when I was, and I loved reading fantasy books as well. And I had kind of like my own rudimentary ideas about the spiritual processes and things when I was a kid from 7 to 16, but I didn't really know that magic existed. And then I was reading a book one day, and a fantasy book, and this kid sat down and he proceeded to tell me this story about how he was astral projecting and how he encountered a demon. And he told me this story because he was trying to freak me out. He's like, oh, he likes reading fantasy books, I'm going to mess with him. So the last thing he expected was for me to just look at him calmly and say, where can I learn more? And he blinked. He's kind of like, oh, okay. So the next day he brought some pamphlets and I devoured those. I read them and I started practicing the exercises. And then he showed me the local metaphysical shop and I picked up books there. And I mean, from there, it was just kind of like that was it. I'd found my avenue for exploring, and I started just reading these books and working through them. And then I started experimenting within a couple of years. And developing my own unique systems and ideas and continuing to learn. And that's really how it's been. And I've always had a very intimate connection with the spirit world as a result, but also I found that, the magic has definitely played a significant role in my artistic output, not just as a writer. I'm also a painter. So I also do acrylics and watercolor. collage and other things like that. And all of those things are an integral part of my creative and magical expression. So it's helped me to explore those aspects in my life. And then, yeah, I have written a lot of books. I'm working on the next one right now. It's another fiction book. So it's always, there's always, and there's tons of projects back here cooking away. I'm pretty excited about them, and seeing what'll come with them.
So just pick up on the books a minute. When did you start? When did you write your first one?
I wrote and published my first book in 2003.
Right.
And it was, I co-wrote the book Creating Magical Entities with David Michael Cunningham and Trayona Wagner. And we wrote that book. And then shortly after that, I wrote Pop Culture Magic, my first solo book, and just went from there. And so it just ended up being a very... And the irony of it all is that I probably would have been a lot more prolific as a writer if I had not subscribed to the belief that you couldn't make a living as a writer. I was a very limiting belief that I held on to for a long time.
That's interesting.
Yeah, unfortunately, unfortunately, that's a belief that is put out there. It's not so prevalent anymore, but it was out there for a while. I think that the rise of indie publishing has really changed that around. I mean, there are people who are making a very viable living, including people who are making six figures just writing and writing books. I'm not one of those people as of yet, but I'm definitely working on it, and I think it's really empowering to realize that you can make a living with your writing. It requires a lot more than just writing the books. You got to be willing to market. You've got to be willing to do a lot of other things, but it is a viable way to make a living.
Yeah. So there's interesting this because I'm always sort of drawing comparisons between people writing books or people being musicians, because that is the sort of thing that is said to people want to get start a career in music, that you're not going to be able to get make a living out of it. Particularly when I started, it was like a complete no-no. Mm-hmm. But of course, what happens is that I think, first of all, as you say, if you start with that assumption that you can't, it sort of puts you on the back foot, really. Mm-hmm. And I've often sort of considered that it's like you've got to have this sort of naivety, like you've got to think that you can do it, even when people could sort of go, statistically it's impossible, right? Because I think this is one of these sort of weird things that it's actually, as soon as you start, especially anything with the arts, I think, as soon as you start to do something, things happen. Like you're saying about these weird connections, like you're walking along and you see adverts for tarot classes, and it's just in that moment, it's exactly what you need at that time. You know what I mean? Yeah. And one of the sort of things that keeps coming up in this podcast is these accidental meetings. People just bump into somebody who they haven't seen for ages, and it just happens that this person's I was thinking about you the other day because blah blah blah. And it's so common. And it may only appear to happen to people like once or twice in their life, but as soon as you start talking to a lot of people, you realize this happens a lot. Whether we don't spot those things. Now, what I'm intrigued by is with the sort of, this ability to think outside of a completely materialist framework, how much you become more aware and more observant of things like that. Because I think you do. I just wonder whether, you've got any sort of examples where you go, oh God, yeah, I did this and this happened, and you get the ripple effect or whatever.
That's actually something that I recommend in a class I just presented for the first time at Eugene Pagan Pride we had last weekend. And it's a class on how to live a magical life. And that's one of the concepts, is when those things happen, when you were thinking, oh, I was just thinking about my old friend Elizabeth, and then you happen to run into her somewhere where you weren't intending to go. And recognizing that those things are, are real parts of the human experience, acknowledging them and paying more attention to when they happen, allows them to open up. And I think what you're really saying is that when we authentically acknowledge, my dream and desire is to play my guitar, that's what I want to do with my life, or it's to write novels, and allow your heart to have the space to follow that path, then you open up to a lot more magic, because you're really being authentic with who you want to be and allowing it to happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I found that a lot of times it's really about opening your awareness. People get tunnel visioned about what they think is possible, and that limits it. But when you open your awareness, you suddenly discover, well, there's a lot more out there, and you begin to uncover these potential realities where you end up meeting. And I think what's fascinating too is that it can even be like, you can meet, it can be someone that you thought of, like, oh, I haven't talked to so and so in ages, and all of a sudden they ring you up and like, oh, hey, I was thinking about you the other day. I mean, that definitely happens. But then also I think it even comes down to the possibilities and opportunities that come into your life that are brand new, or things along those lines. Like, you have different vectors that bring things in. One of the things that fascinates me sometimes is I'll think about like the possible avenues where how something could have happened. And the reason why is because I like to look at those possibilities and consider, like, what are all the different permutations, the different ways, like that something could have happened, and map that out as a way of exploring the lattice of time and space, and getting a better sense of clarity as to why something did happen the way it did, but also to recognize the fruitfulness of it, and then being able to play with those possibilities and explore them in relationship to other things. Because, like, as an example, Joanna and I here live in Eugene. I've lived here for 2 years now, actually. Wow, 2 years. And Joanna's been living here a lot longer. We only met in the last a little over half a year ago, but we could have met sooner than that. And it's interesting to me to consider that sometimes, like, where, this is a relatively small area. Where are the possible vectors and things like that? And it doesn't matter that, I mean, we met where we met. That's all that really matters in the end. But it's just an interesting, fascinating exercise, because it helps you to start to see also, like, where are the other places that I could go, the other spaces, where then I can meet and encounter various other people, various other things. Like, where are the possibilities and the opportunities that I may not be aware of in a given space, and I can open my mind and my heart and my physicality to this experience. And I think that's a really useful exercise to explore, because then you start to discover hidden facets about the area that you live, and things along those lines. And I think it's the same anywhere you live or anywhere you're at. And that's a creative process in and of itself that allows you to tap into the creativity of the area itself, and how that area, because we live in a dynamic environment where we're a collaborative environment where we're connecting with the world around us. Creativity is not a singular thing. Creativity is a variety of inspirations and ideas and people and all these other things that come into your life and inspire you. And so we take that as a whole. And that's one of the reasons I like to explore that kind of exercise, because then it helps me as a writer to also produce really interesting, like fiction writing, for example, really good scenes, or it helps me to map out what I could do with space-time magic or things along those lines.
Okay. Let's do a thing about timing. There's a couple of things that came up in this. How familiar are you with Alan Moore?
I'm familiar with Alan Moore. Yeah, I mean, I've read Watchmen and some of his other Promethea, as well as V for Victory and all that. Yeah.
So he does a lot of stuff about place, because obviously he lives in Northampton. And he doesn't sort of go anywhere. That's where he is. He doesn't travel very much or anything. And he writes a lot about Northampton. So Jerusalem, which is this sort of tome of the book that he did, is all about Northampton, but in different periods of time. So it's a sort of a book, a magical book about different time frames, different dimensions, and everything, all focused on Northampton. So some of the things are historical. So I'm quite intrigued by this because obviously living in the UK, we've got layer upon layer of stuff everywhere, right? So I douse. So that's one of the things that I do. And it doesn't matter where you are in the UK. It's not like you've got a void. It's like, well, which whatever level you're on, you know that this spot of ground had some settlement before it, and then a settlement before that, and so on. It goes right back. And I think that's something that's very interesting. You said about sort of time and space as an idea for, it gives you creative ideas, because there's this thing about context and environment, ecosystem and stuff. And I've always found this intriguing, that you can't separate the thing from the environment, if you see what I mean. The idea, like you were saying, you're being influenced from everywhere. You think an idea comes from you, but it's also placed in the place that you are. That influences you, and however that comes. It could be something that's unseen that's influencing you. It could be just the landscape, or it could be something about the resonance of the landscape and you in it, and all the rest of it. So when you're talking about one of the books we were saying about time space, is it called Time Space Magic?
Space-time magic. So I've got Space-time Magic Foundation, Space-time Magic, and then Magical Identity. And then some of my other books touch on the subject in general.
So that, I think, is fascinating, because one of the things I think is quite intriguing about time is how things happen out of time. Magical things happen out of time when you put out for something and it sort of arrives in the post the next day, type of thing. You think, how the hell does that work? Yeah, how many times does that happen? It happens all the time, doesn't it? Does it not happen all the time? You put out for something, it's like, well, it's already in the post, or it's already on its way. Sort of weird. And particularly when you get a multiple effect, where people go, oh, coincidence. You get layer upon layer of things that sort of it's like a ripple effect that comes like this, and it's sort of stacked up out of time. Like you don't have to wait for 3 weeks for that to arrive. It happens, the next day or 2 days later or whatever. And it's like, well, these things have come sometimes from, in my case, from the other side of the planet in the post. You think it's just like totally nuts, weird. So the creative process then, let's go back, let's sort of drag this back, because I'm for a start, Taylor, I don't know how you can do 50 books. I mean, I have enough trouble. I've written one. It's just about, it's taken me about 10 years to write. So what's the process with this? Because there must be something that it's not a case of just sitting down and writing a book, is it? I'm sure.
Well, no, I mean, there's definitely a process. I discovered early on, as a process for my creativity, that one of the best ways to generate creativity was really based around my curiosity. I have an insatiable curiosity about the world. I'm always asking questions. I'm always generating ideas. It's kind of funny because Joanna and I, when we first met, I was like, oh, I got all these ideas. And she's like, I can only do one idea a day. Now she does more ideas. I think it's hilarious. She said now she's generating lots of ideas every day. So, it's kind of like the idea generation in and of itself is like a meme. It infects you at that point. You start to see more of the of all the possibilities. In my case, what I've done is I took my creativity and I found ways to work through the blockages. So like as an example, I play video games late at night, not every night, but some nights. And I mention this because for me, playing a video game is a magical act where I actually use it to generate creativity. It allows my thinking mind to go into the back here and just be quiet. Monkey mind is quiet and I'm just playing. But every push of the button, I've got this sigil that I created a long time ago. And every push of the button, everything I do goes into the sigil and it's designed to destroy blockages, create blockages. And so then I end up producing. I find myself always being inspired, always writing. And that's just one example, one
Mm.
mechanism at work, if you will. I mean,
Mm.
for me, it also boils down to, having all these different ideas and coming up with them and wanting to write about them and share them with the world and realizing, like, in a very real sense too, like I'm probably at the end of my life going to still have ideas cooking up that I'm not going to get to. I'm going to have to make sure I find somebody much younger than me, and then I'll be like, here's these ideas. Now you write them, and I'll like pass it on as a spiritual transmission to make sure that it goes out there. But it's one of those cases where you set your environment up for creativity. The other thing though, and here's the interesting thing, is that I only write maybe like an hour a day. So you might be surprised, like, oh wow, you've written 50 books. How is it that you can do that with only writing? But it's concentrated, focused writing. I find that if I try to force myself to write like an 8 hour day, it's not going to happen. I get, it's just dull. It gets really dull. If I try to write like a 4 hour day, occasionally I'll have, a thing where I'll write for like a couple of hours or maybe like 3 hours. Like I'll really just hit my stride and I'll get a bunch of writing out and it's great. But the other thing too is I'm always changing my approach to creativity. Like I was saying to Joanna the other day, like I have this Patreon and I've been putting articles out. I'm like, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just going to do videos. And the reason why is because I can create a video in like 5-10 minutes, get my idea out, and people can consume that and work with it. Whereas me writing an article about the same thing takes an hour. And I'm
Yeah.
like, that's taking away from writing my books. And I want to focus on writing my books. And I'm realizing, like, I have to be willing to continually change my creative process. And I think that's a huge part of it as well.
Yeah,
And
that's good. Joanna, what you've now got loads of ideas. So whereas you said you didn't have,
well,
what
speaking
happened?
about time, speaking of
Oh,
time,
yes.
Taylor is the fastest reader I have ever met. And I thought that I was an incredibly fast reader. He reads a lot of books in a very short amount of time. And I don't know how he does it. I think it's something magical.
Mm.
And so I don't know. It's really astonishing. You see, there's like 5 or 6 books that he's reading at a time. And then the next day, it's like 2 of them are different. It's really remarkable. So there's
Oh, okay.
something to do with his process in consuming the written word that I think has to do with how he also produces it.
Mm, that's fascinating. What's the secret then, Taylor?
Well, again, I mean, I'm just I feed my brain. I feed my creativity. I mean, I'm always reading. I am always reading a wide variety of books. I've got a book on Kindle I'm reading right now. I've actually got about bookmarks in 10 or so books. A couple I haven't started reading yet, but other ones which I'm partway through. And I'll read, and what I'll do is I'll sometimes sit down in the evening and I'll read for like an hour or so. Again, I don't read for a super large amount of time. It's better to do these things in concentrated doses.
Yeah.
But I'll go from book to book to book. So I'll read a book, for example, on architectural design and how it's like generating a living process, which has nothing to do with magic, but has a lot to do with life. And then I'll read a book about how not to die, a dietitian book. And then I'll read a book about crypto. And then I'll read a book about, some business thing. And then I'll read some magic books and some books on sacred masculinity. That's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm doing a lot of work around sacred masculinity and then also some more magic books. And and I'll take all of that and I'll connect it together as well. And the reason what I do is I read, these different segments of each of these different books. I'm not just reading one book at a time. I'm reading all of them together. And the reason why is because I find lots of different connections between them, and I find a way to connect them together. And that's what helps me produce the unique content that I come out with my books. where it's really, I mean, really, there is no other writer out there like me as far as the occult books go. Nobody else really writes about the topics and blends in the non-occult disciplines or things like that. And a large part of that is because of the way that I consume content and the way that I think about things. I'm always looking at a variety of different material or concepts or ideas. And I mean, I also watch. I don't watch a lot of TV. I mean, I watch a bit, but and I'm very careful about the subscription services and stuff like that. But again, even then, I'm always getting inspired by things. I'm taking stuff in, and then I'm generating that output. Now what now? Now I want to shift it over to Joanna because she also does some
Yeah,
really interesting stuff. She's got this poetic prompt that she does each week that she's gotten from someone. So I want you to talk about that
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah. Go on,
really
go
need
on.
stuff too creatively.
So, you were saying about how ideas are out there. Maybe they belong to a place or a time. They're not necessarily ours.
No,
There are many like significant scientific discoveries that have been found by two people far from each other at the
yeah,
same time.
yeah,
And I have that kind of idea about poems, for example, that they have their own life in some poetic reality and they want to be written. They need a poet to write them. And there's a number of musicians and other artists who say the same thing, that the songs are out there and they want someone to write them down. And
yeah,
so I have found in my process, I have not ever stopped writing poetry since I got my degree. I've self-published in small, handmade chapbooks, artist chapbooks. Taylor and I are getting ready to publish a larger version in a more mainstream indie publishing. Can indie publishing be mainstream? Well, more mainstream than I've published myself yet to date. Um, but I find that the poems are out there, and when I have set aside the time, they show up. So I'm basically writing a book that is a poem that writes itself. It just needs me to get it out into the world. Um, yeah, and the poet that I work with, her name is Kate Ballou, and she has a fascinating practice. She does present a poetic prompt every week for her followers, and it's very magical. She's an apprentice witch, and she does a lot of other things in terms of herbalism and poetry. And when I came across her on Instagram, I was like, this is interesting, and this could really be a discipline that I could utilize to kind of corral some of my energies around what I want to be doing with my writing. And it really
yeah,
has helped provide some discipline. So I think that's the thing about art and writing, music, all of these disciplines and magic, that what we're finding these days is that the more collaborative we become with it, the more profound it becomes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. You're saying about, you know, the poems already existing and music
Mhm.
already existing. Because I do a lot of encouraging people to write songs and stuff, and that's one of the things I say, that you're not, you're part of the process, but you're not actually writing it. You're just the conduit that is coming through. And
Yeah.
I always quote Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. His thing is, the songs are already out there. You just need to get your guitar and hook them in.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is it gets you out of the way. It gets your sort of ego out of the way when you do
Mhm.
stuff. And I think
Mhm.
that's a really important thing. So you get that sort of moment where you sort of get that flow thing going. And it does happen.
Mhm.
Because I use things like sort of cut up quite a bit when I'm working where, the Burroughs technique. But of course, cut up
Oh
is in it.
yeah.
Yeah. But interestingly,
Oh, can I stop you there for we can go right back to your point, but when Taylor and I were first falling in love, he wrote me so many poems. He still writes me poems, but I was overwhelmed. So I used the cut up process with his poems, and I would cut up all the words from his poems and make a new poem and send it back to him.
oh, wow. That's
So
cool.
there's one of those little
Yeah,
synchronicities
yeah,
or
yeah.
coincidences.
Yeah, yeah,
So
it's brilliant.
anyway, go on with you use the
Well,
cut up process. How do you
well,
use
the
it?
thing about cut up really is it's like what Tony was saying about reading lots of books that aren't about a specific thing. You know, instead of it being just you're gonna, you know, you're reading a load of books about magic or whatever. As soon as you take this sort of cross section thing, you get this like a web appear.
Yeah.
So the thing that happens with cut up is it's the sort of central image that sits inside the thing. So once you've got all the stuff and you read it, you know, you read the lines back, you know what it's about, you know what the song's about, and you can have a picture about it and all the rest of it. It's like a sort of a living thing inside these lines. And I think that's what sort of goes on with us. It's that sort of connective thing that we do. So, you know, going back to what Tony was saying about listening to reading lots of different books and all the rest of it, that's the sort of thing that is sort of happening, I guess, where this idea that might be to do with, I don't know, finance or something, this over here is to do with herbalism, and this over here is to do with such and such, they suddenly make sense because, you know, we just sort of put things together in interesting ways. And I think that's the problem, that when people try to write something, it's all a bit intellectual. And as soon as you do that, it stops that part of the brain connecting up somehow, or whatever that, you know, however you want to explain it. So yeah, that's interesting. But I love that idea about you doing cut up with a poem. That, you know, that's brilliant. It's a brilliant idea.
Someday we might even put it out as a book. I've written many more poems since then, so she's got a lot to catch up on because at a certain point we stopped. And but that's all right.
I also developed a formula. I developed a formula that's sort of a mathematical formula that I would apply to his poems to rearrange the words in them and create a new poem. And then that sparked the idea of presenting to other, you know, other magicians and magical people, as well as creative people, this process as a magical process. And a way of creating a magical working by using a kind of a mathematical formula to take words from, for example, say you have a cherished book of information, you know, or it could be a song from someone that you really respect and admire. You apply this formula, say every seventh word and then the third word from the bottom. And you apply that formula to the song, lyrics, or a paragraph from the book. And then you take that away and you say, okay, this is my mission, or this is the intent of the magical working, or this is provides some sort of mystical information that I've been looking for. We're still working on that idea and how, like, we have to experiment some more about how that works in practical applications.
It's like a sort of mathematical bibliomancy.
Yes.
That's the thing. Well, anyway,
and I want to touch on the cut up method a bit more, because I actually in college I took a for my senior, my final, like one of my final college things was a program around Burroughs. We actually studied all of his writing and his reading and his magical processes and stuff. So that was really fun for me. And it's heavily influenced my work. I mean, I read all of his, I've read all of his books, still have some of them, not all of them, but I still have some of them, and they're really fascinating. And for me, I've applied this cut up technology as well with collages, with other things. And I found that what's interesting about cut up is that it slips through time. It breaks the meanings and patterns that were already there, and it introduces new ones, and it creates this sense of time slippage that then allows things in and allows for different connections and things along those lines. And so when Joanna wrote back with the poems, I thought it was fascinating because it was like this interesting break between what I had written and then what she was creating, and yet it was still us connecting with each other, getting to know each other. And it was just this profound process of evolution, writing wise, magically, and of course also personally and romantically. And so it's a good example of how you can take a creative practice and transform it into this process of evolution that changes the entire experience in a very dynamic way.
Mm, mm. Yeah, Burroughs, I mean, because obviously I'm dealing with a lot of people who are musicians who are not particularly aware of Burroughs' stuff. You know, I often say to him, you know, he's the most important person in pop music that nobody ever knows to them, because he knew everyone, which is pretty remarkable. He had such a long life for somebody who was a junkie. You know, because obviously people like Bowie and everything, but of course he knew the Beatles and all the rest of it. And as soon as you show people the technique and you say, well, you know, this has been used by everyone because Burroughs showed them the technique. And then you show them a Beatles track like I Am a Walrus or something like that, and, you know, and a Nirvana song and a Bowie song, and it blows people's minds because they don't realize the process, right? But then you sort of go, well, yeah, but he didn't just do that. He also, you know, he's the godfather of sampling. This idea of just recording on tape things, you know, sounds in the street and or TV programs, and sort of just, you know, going through the channels, you know, sort of zapping through the channels and then recording it and then cutting the tape up and putting it back together and stuff like this. And it's like, my God, this guy was just utterly incredible. I mean, it wasn't just him because it was Brian Geisen as well, but it's that process that you realise, and because he was using it for magical things as well, apart from, you know, okay, art is magic anyway, full stop, really. But it's so sort of fully formed with him. It's not like, it doesn't even appear to be like work in progress, if you sort of mean. I don't know if that's you came across that when you were reading his stuff, but it's like he got the idea and it was working not straight off the bat, you know. Incredible. I mean, he fascinates me.
I think it was always a work in progress with him. I mean, that's the thing. I think you look at any creative person, and even if their work seems like it's finalized, it's really not. I mean, I know that I'm always creating, always writing, and so that's very much like my impression of Burroughs' work. I mean, he was an absolute genius.
Oh yeah.
It's an interesting story, you know, along the lines of that cut up tape. I was reading about it where one time he went to a cafe and I guess the owner
Yes.
did something that offended him so much that he went
Yes.
the next day, came back, and he had this tape of just horrible noises. And he walked past it and cursed the place, and the place shut down. And then, like shortly after,
Yeah.
and then the next couple of businesses failed because of what he had done. He basically, going back to the layer concept, inserted into the layer of space and time there this curse that would cause the place not to work. And it didn't.
Incredible.
And it was a brilliant example of cursing magic right there.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what I mean. So, and of course, if you look at the impact of the songs that are written with cut up, they've got that sort of impact. You know, I think some of Bowie's songs, I mean, Heroes is a good example, I think. There's obviously that going on. It's also in the sequences of the chords and everything like that, because Brian Eno's obviously doing something very similar to the chord sequence. But you think the impact of that song, which on the face of it doesn't make sense, but it's obviously hinting at something in particular, Berlin Wall probably. But it's such an extraordinarily powerful song. And I think that's the thing when you see those techniques in action, you can't quite put your finger on what it is that's going on, but it's like, it's just not another thing, is it? It's just not like another song. It's incredible. So yeah. But I am aware of that.
The sort of weird thing about this is that I never studied Burroughs. And I didn't know that the cut up technique was a thing. I just thought, what am I going to do with all these words that this guy is sending me? I know I need to send him something back, but I was just,
what am I going to do with this crazy guy writing poetry to me? What am I going to do about
I was like, I have all this material, but I didn't have any. I wasn't accessing any of my own material, you know, any of my own words. I was like, what am I going to do with it? So somehow, you know, I think, and it's one of those coincidental things or one of those synchronistic or psychic things, you know, I picked up on this concept that I don't ever recall hearing of. The closest thing that I know that I learned about was when I was taking art classes is where that, what do you call, I forget what it's called, but it's when someone draws a picture and then folds
It
over
folds
half
it.
of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the closest thing that I remember learning about to the cut up technique, but probably because of Taylor's, early experience with burrows, that was somehow sealed up in his poem already.
Yeah, I think
And
that's right.
I unlocked it and used that technique
Yeah,
and sent it
yeah.
back.
I think that.
You
I
see,
think
you can
that's
see why I falling in love with this person.
yeah,
She's so
absolutely. I get
amazing.
that.
She's
I get that.
absolutely
Absolutely.
amazing. She's like brilliant.
Yeah.
Well,
So
we're more brilliant together.
Yes, we are.
this is very good. There's also the fact that art has a transference thing. Anyway,
Yeah.
If you listen to somebody create something and they've got a picture in their mind about what it is this piece of music is about, people listening to it will get the same picture.
Yeah.
I've had that happen a lot with people.
Yeah.
And they're sort of stunned when they realize that is actually happening, that somebody listening to their piece has got the same visual image about the piece of music that they've got. But you think, well, why not? I think that's the thing, isn't it? Because maybe at one point in time we wouldn't have thought that was unusual.
Well, in Burroughs, I mean, for Burroughs, that was a huge part of his work too. He talked about the word as a virus. He talked about these ideas of spreading things. So like it makes total sense that, like even if you're not familiar with him, that if you met someone who was, you could pick up on that. So I mean, but it's another example of just kind of like a spiritual lineage of sorts as well through creative practices. We talk about spiritual lineages in terms of strict magical practices, but I mean, I think it applies to writing and creativity as well, and art and music, that there are different lineages and that you can find yourself connected to someone that you may never have met. You might not even be overtly familiar with their work, and yet because somebody else is familiar, there's this spiritual transmission that passes on.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. So something that you mentioned earlier, Joanna, about the work that you do, you mentioned sort of Venus workings and stuff like that. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how?
Sure. I studied with a teacher who did moon ceremony primarily for many years, 13 years, in fact. And, and she passed away just before the pandemic, which was probably a blessing. So one of the ceremonies that she also taught me was what to do when Venus goes retrograde. So, planets going retrograde, like the planet has an orbit, right? And from our vantage point on Earth, it seems like they change direction or something. When Venus goes retrograde, she disappears from the sky because she's in the heavens when it's daytime for us. And Venus is also one of the most recognizable stars, or lights in the sky, right? So from ancient times, it would be really easy to track that movement. She actually, when you look at it from the vantage point of Earth, she makes a 5-pointed star over a period of 8 years. Every retrograde is a little loop in the star, the point of a star. So, I'm not going to go into the whole, there's a lot to talk about the pentacle. But one really interesting thing is that roses also have 5 points, right? Yeah. And that's, the epitome of beauty. It's also a metaphor for finding the divine or finding the beloved. I mean, there's so much in that. So when Venus goes retrograde, it's a really powerful time for anyone who feels drawn to that type of magic to do their own inner work, to go inward and look at what's sort of in our personal underworlds. And what I do is a labyrinth ceremony. And it's about walking the labyrinth of your own soul and about making personal vows to how you want to live your life. So there's a beginning ceremony right before she goes retrograde. Venus is the evening star, and she's often really closely aligned with Mars in the sky. You can see her in the sunset. And there's a beginning ceremony where we talk about what all of this means, the history of the goddess, and what we do. Taylor and I did this most recent retrograde, which we're in right now. We learn how to draw a labyrinth. So there's a creative process of making a piece of visual art. And then when she's coming out of the retrograde, we come back together and we talk about the vows that we're going to make going forward for the next 18 months while she's in her forward motion.
Mm.
So this has a lot to do with bringing back the divine feminine and doing the work to heal the breaches that have been made between the masculine and the feminine. But it also has to do with our own work for self-respect, our work around our values about beauty and love and art and music, all the luxuries in the world, and just how we want to walk our path in those ways.
Mm.
And the labyrinth is a very, very powerful symbol to work with because it allows you to make a very long pilgrimage in a very short place, a very small place.
Mm.
There's also a fascinating aspect about this too, from a temporal perspective, because we're dealing with this Venus going retrograde every 18 months. And so there's an element of iterative magic where if you're doing a ritual, every time you do that ritual in relationship to the previous time and all the times that you will do it in the future, you are creating this echo across time, and if you will, a cut up really across time of the various rituals. So like every time, for example, Joanna and I do new moon ritual or full moon ritual or something like that, we're also creating this echo across time to all the other times that we've done new and full moon rituals, both separately and together, and creating this string. And it's the same thing with this Venus return, where this is the first time I'm doing something with this, with her, but she's done it multiple times. And yet at the same time, there is like this sense of an echo where I know that I'll be doing it in the future again, so there's this continuum that's created. And I think that's another fascinating aspect with magic and creativity in general, that every time, if you think about it, when you make music or you write or you do art or whatever else, you're referring to all the other times that you've done that as well. And you're drawing on all those experiences, and you draw on all the future potential as well.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a really good point. Because that's one of the things, again, people assume that you don't do that, that a new project is a new project, and of course it isn't. It's definitely, so
there's also the opportunity about building relationship. And so each time, you could think of this, each time you sit down to write a song, you're creating a deeper relationship with your musical instruments or with the songwriting process. And in doing a Venus return ceremony or doing a moon ceremony, in my philosophy, it's about creating relationship with that actual physical object out in space. I'm acknowledging that Venus is going through a dramatic change relative to Earth, and I want to support that by aligning my own personal work with what Venus is doing. And so it's a bigger cycle. The new moon and the full moon is a lot more accessible to most people because it's a lot more visible. And we really do feel those changes in our body, in the tides, and that sort of thing. But when we look at iterative magic as a way of creating relationship over time with the activity, with the tools that we're using, with the other people involved, it really deepens the whole process and the whole concept. Yeah.
Again, that's that thing of working with other people,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of collaborative
Collaborating,
thing.
yeah.
And again, that's one of those, because we are social creatures anyway, aren't we? Let's face it.
Mm-hmm.
We just think that we're individuals, but and I think even when you appear to be writing something on your own, you're still accessing things that other people have
Mm-hmm.
been party to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think again, that's one of those things that, like you're saying, with the work that you do with, say, Venus or the moon,
Mm-hmm.
it's not you on your own. It's this sort of thing that you're honoring something else. I think that's a really important thing that we sort of forget. That thing of like being indebted to something. I think this might be a way of putting it. I don't know.
And there's a way of, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I was just sort of thinking out loud, but yeah.
There's a way of also of connecting in these moments to everyone else who is doing that same activity. And I learned this through the practice of Reiki, which is an energy healing modality. It's from a Japanese, it was transmitted by a Japanese person, over 100 years ago. So it does have a completely different cultural context. But one of the things I learned is when I'm doing Reiki healing, I can reach out and tap into anyone else who is doing that same energy work at that time. And that idea can be applied to any other creative process where, sitting down to write or sitting down to make a painting, you can tap into anyone who has done this activity across time or space and get in. There's a way of getting into that network that transcends time and space and making some really profound, advancements in your work through that.
Which sort of ties into something you said right at the very beginning, where you said that two people can have the same idea and they're completely different places on the planet.
Yeah.
Which is that's sort of that sort of morphic thing, that sort of resonance thing. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Well, look, we've been talking for nearly an hour. That's been a good game. That was awesome. Yeah. That was really, really great. And I'll put some stuff in the show notes about where people can contact you and everything, so you can send me some stuff. So yeah, websites and what have you. We can check out your work. Taylor, your stuff, is it all accessible on your website, or is it just? I know you can get it on Amazon stuff.
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon, but you can also order it direct from me. So
that sounds better.
Yeah, it is better. I get more of the I get more money for one thing, which is good. That supports the work, and so I always recommend that. But regardless, yeah, you can find it. You can find it at different online retailers as well. And
how did you come across Taylor? Like, why did you
decide to? I read some of his books.
Oh, okay, cool.
Actually, I got one of yours on Audible a little while ago.
Oh, cool.
Like, I want to talk to this guy and find out more. That's awesome.
Yeah. No, I busy myself being nosy, basically, and talking to people about what they do. I mean, that's what it fascinates me, because again, a lot of these ideas I find useful for just your own creativity, my own creativity, but also I teach a lot. I teach a lot of people to play and write songs, and I do different projects and stuff like that. And like you're saying, Taylor, a lot of the ideas come left field. They're not necessarily the thing, if you're teaching music, the answer might be something to do with linguistics.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. All kinds of different things, and that's the beauty of it, and I think if you cultivate an approach where you deliberately open yourself up to a wide variety of perspectives, it changes the way you look at the world and experience it. I mean, that is a big result for a big reason why I have all the creativity I have. I mean, I've always been willing to look at different things and consider different perspectives. I don't always agree with everything I read, most definitely not, but I definitely get something out of it, even when I don't agree with it.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think what it does, it sort of makes you observant of things in a way that you wouldn't normally be if you're reading lots of diverse things. Even as you say, even in something you might not agree with, or whatever, there'll be something in there that you go, that's interesting. That's an interesting viewpoint that you may have never considered. Yeah, that's really cool. Great stuff. Well, thank you very much. Don't disappear. I'll say goodbye now and have a quick chat before we finish. All right. Awesome. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.